Good evening, everyone. My name is William Milberg. I'm the Dean of the New School for Social Research. I'd like to welcome everyone to the New School historic 12th Street Auditorium. Welcome. Our university was founded nearly 100 years ago on principles of free intellectual exchange on complex world matters. That value remains central to our mission today. This is a home for impassioned discussions and intense inquiry. We are proud of our role as a vital center for public discourse around a wide range of issues and ideas through some 1,400 public events, lectures, exhibits, and performances every year. The New School's commitment to free expression of ideas means hearing a wide range of perspectives. Sometimes this means that we hear about ideas from individuals that many strongly disagree with or even find disturbing. But as a community, we listen critically, we debate vigorously, and we discuss respectfully as we question and challenge scholars, journalists, policymakers, artists, activists, and organizers from a broad range of backgrounds, ideological viewpoints, and positions. Over the past week or so, we have heard strong, thoughtful criticism, feedback from many individuals regarding tonight's event. We take the directness of this feedback and the convictions and values they express very seriously. We look forward to engaging with other perspectives on related issues in the months ahead. We are hosting tonight's discussion in the spirit of free expression, and we look forward to a respectful conversation. So welcome to the New School. Tonight's event was conceived by its organizers, Jacobin, Jewish Voice for Peace, Haymarket Books, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, following the publication of JVP's anthology on anti-Semitism, solidarity, and the struggle for justice. Thank you for being here at the New School, and now I'd like to welcome to the New School Rabbi Alyssa Wise, Deputy Director of Jewish Voice for Peace, to introduce tonight's speaker. Rabbi Wise.
Good evening. Good evening and welcome. It's really amazing in this devastating political moment to be in this room with you all with such a wide spectrum of political positions talking about an issue so urgent. Take just a moment right now and look around you and give a wave and a hello to the people who are here tonight, who took their Tuesday evening to come have this conversation. Hi, make friends. It's like making friends at the Antisemitism event. That's what Trump has brought us, friends. So as you might have seen on your way in or on the internet, there are those who are not so happy about this event tonight. And the model of joint struggle to end anti-Semitism and all forms of oppression that JVP's book and this panel plans to address and discuss. You may have heard that this gathering and some of our incredible speakers have been facing some ugly attacks from the pro-occupation, deeply Islamophobic right who want to claim a monopoly on talking about anti-Semitism. But there is no monopoly on talking about anti-Semitism. Because of this, we might have people in the room who might try to disrupt the proceedings, though we hope they won't, and they will instead listen and take in what each speaker has to say. If they do, this could be a terrific opportunity, where the purpose of a potential disruption is to break our resolve and to shatter our unity and interrupt our ability to build together. If it happens, we will make it the opposite. We can use this moment to strengthen our focus, act as powerful, united whole, and leave with some enhanced right-wing handling skills. If we focus on making this moment about what we are here to do, about what we can do when we stay focused on each other and our political vision, their disruption will end up being a gift. We are well prepared for this moment. We have a team of well-trained leaders with welcome badges from both JVP and JFREJ who are prepared to handle whatever happens. But we do need a few things from you. First, breathe. Stay calm and collected and connected to the purpose of why you chose to come here tonight. Remember why you're here, to understand anti-Semitism and fight it together with all forms of oppression. And trust the team and know you're part of it. In the event of a disruption of any kind, follow the front of the room leadership and make room for the welcome team to do their work. We will respond to whatever happens this weekend the way we always do at JVP, with love, intention, fierceness, and care. The same way we intend to fight anti-Semitism and all forms of oppression. We'll never leave the fight against anti-Semitism to those who cynically exploit very real and well-founded fears of anti-Jewish prejudice in order to advance their own oppressive agendas. JVP is proud of our Jewishness and proud of our support for Palestinians. And with your help, we can keep fighting for equality for all people everywhere. It's my great honor to introduce our tremendous panel. Amy Goodman, Leo Ferguson, Lena Morales, Rebecca Vilkomerson, and Linda Sarsour. Enjoy.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm Amy Goodman, host of Democracy Now!, a daily grassroots global news hour. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that we all sit around and debate and discuss the critical issues of the day. It is an honor to be with all of you tonight. I'm sure you will agree with each other on many issues and disagree with each other on many issues, and we honor all of that. This summer, there was a horrific scene that played out in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was in August when hundreds of young white men walked across the campus of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, many of them carrying torches saying, "Blood and soil, and Jews will not replace us." They described themselves as white supremacists, white nationalists, as proud fascists. What perhaps was most terrifying was, though there were many Klan members, they didn't find it necessary to cover their faces with hoods. They felt safe enough in this climate to be identified. That perhaps was the scariest part of what happened. Oh, well, the next day, of course, when one of them plowed a car into a group of anti-racists and killed a young woman named Heather Heyer. As they chanted that, they were also there to protect white Confederate statues. This was a blending that they were doing. They were teaching us certainly about intersectionality. Racism, anti-Semitism, and the President of the United States used the opportunity not to attack them, but to talk about violence coming from all sides, and on this side, the very fine people who had come out. There was a second rally in Charlottesville of white supremacists, and he used that opportunity to attack black athletes who were engaged in civil rights protests, as they have been to this day, taking the knee. Anti-Semitism, racism, and of course, all of this in this period, the climate basically the stage set when President Trump, in one of his first proud actions, announced the Muslim ban. Muslim ban 1, and then Muslim ban 2. It was, well, he described them as so-called judges who stopped him in his tracks, right? You had the judge in Washington State, and then you had the judge in Hawaii. What was it that Jeff Sessions said, the Attorney General of the United States, speaking on a right-wing radio talk show, said, how is it possible that a man in the Pacific on an island can stop the President of the United States? So racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. They put it all together for us. And today we're going to look at these various hates and what it means with a very interesting panel, all who've been involved with a book that has just been published called On Antisemitism, Jewish Voice for Peace, Solidarity, and the Struggle for Justice. I want to introduce our panelists. They will each speak for, around 7 or 8, 9 minutes. I'm not a strict timekeeper, except when it comes to Democracy Now! And then we'll have a discussion. And while they speak, feel free, I hope all of you got index cards. Feel free to write down your questions or comments, and people will pick up those index cards, and we'll hope to get to some of your questions by the end of this evening. And at the end, folks here will be signing books. So I'm going to start by introducing Len Ferguson, who is the movement building organizer for JFRIJ, that's Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. A New York native with a long history of working for social justice as well as in nonprofit communications. He's developed an anti-oppression trainings for JFRIJ as well as leading affinity groups and caucuses exploring internalized anti-Jewish oppression, race and racism, and class-based oppression. He's the founder of JFRIJ's Jews of Color Caucus, a lead organizer for the Jews of Color National Convening, and a lead author of JFRIJ's new resource, Understanding Antisemitism. He's a graduate of the Grace Paley Organizing Fellowship, the Ben the Ark Selah Fellowship, and the Join Don't Kvetch Organize Masterclass. A proud Jew of color, a musician in the band Decibelists. His most recent accomplishment is being described as a, quote, black nationalist who spends his time guilt-tripping white people by a right-wing tabloid, which makes him smile. Next to him is Lena Morales, long-standing member of Jewish Voice for Peace, former education chair of JVP Boston, and a core member of the Jews of Color Mizrahim Sephardim Caucus in partnership with JVP. She's a biracial Ashkenazi Jew from Southside Chicago who's been active organizer and educator in the Palestine Solidarity Movement since 1998. She currently is in a full stack boot camp in hopes of making some of that tech money. I don't even know what that means. She told me that people will know what it means for the people that matter to her. Okay. And now we come to Rebecca Volkamerson, who is Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace in 2010. She was named one of the 50 most influential Jewish American leaders by the Forward. My grandparents called it the Fovitz. And this year was named one of the 50 most influential Jews around the world by the Jerusalem Post. Rebecca has been a member of JVP since 2001. She lived with her family in Israel from 2006 to 2009. And I'm going to spend a little more time describing our last speaker. Our last speaker is Linda Sarsour. Linda is an Linda's an award-winning racial justice and civil rights activist, seasoned community organizer, and mother of three. She's a Palestinian Muslim American, born and raised in Brooklyn, former executive director of the Arab American Association of New York, and co-founder of the first Muslim online organizing platform, Empower Change. Linda's been at the forefront of major civil rights campaigns, including calling for an end to unwarranted surveillance of New York's Muslim communities and ending police policies like stop and frisk. In the wake of the police murder of Mike Brown, she co-founded Muslims for Ferguson to build solidarity amongst American Muslim communities and encourage work against police brutality. She's a member of the Justice League NYC, a leading New York force of activists, formerly incarcerated people, and artists working to reform the New York Police Department and the criminal justice system. Linda was instrumental in the Coalition for Muslim School Holidays to push New York City to incorporate 2 Muslim high holy days into the New York City public school calendar. New York City is now the largest school system in the country to officially recognize these holidays. Linda is also a senior fellow at Auburn Seminary, along with leading social justice faith leaders. Most recently, she was the national co-chair of the Women's March on Washington, dubbed the largest single day of protest in U.S. history. And I can vouch for the fact that she was there because Democracy Now! Is doing a live 5-hour broadcast. We had to get up with the sun, or earlier than that, about 3 o'clock in the morning as we were organizing our satellite truck, and who was one of the first ones who was out and about, but Linda Sarsour. She has received numerous awards and honors, including Champion of Change by the White House.
Not
the
this
previous
one.
White House. The YWCA USA's Women of Distinction Award for Advocacy and Civic Engagement, the Hala Maqsood Leadership Award from the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, 2017 Webby Awards, the Andrew Young Foundation's Annual International Leaders Award, the Shirley Chisholm Award by the New York City Council, and recognized by the NAACP New York State Conference, amongst others. Linda was named among 500 of the most influential Muslims in the world, 50 of the world's greatest leaders by Fortune magazine, and featured on the Time magazine's 100 list of the world's most influential people. Linda Sarsour. Linda was profiled on the front page of the New York Times Metro section and dubbed Brooklyn Homegirl in a Hijab. They introduced Linda to the readership as mixing street smarts, activism, and her Muslim identity. Linda Sarsour has become a political force, and maybe that's why she has gotten as much attention as she has gotten, even particularly tonight in the organizing of this event. She's written for and has been featured in local, national, and international media, discussing the impact of domestic policies that target Arab and Muslim American communities, criminal justice issues, and Middle East affairs. I last saw Linda in Washington at the People's Summit. 4,000 people came out. It was a Bernie Sanders event. In fact, Linda Sarsour was a national surrogate for Bernie Sanders and traveled the country for him. I saw her as one of the national speakers at that event, addressing well over 1,000 nurses and many others. So that's who's come out tonight to speak with you, and I hope you will get ready to ask your questions on those cards. But we're going to begin right now with Leo Ferguson.
Hey, Leo.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you all so much for having me here. Thank you to JVP, to the New School, to Jacobin for organizing this incredible event. I'm so grateful. And there couldn't be a more important issue to be talking about right now. That's why JVP puts so much love and care and thought into their wonderful book on anti-Semitism, and it's why Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, where I work, spent over a year researching and writing the resource we just released, Understanding Anti-Semitism. This is just a really critical moment. And this is a topic that there's a lot of confusion about and a lot of misunderstanding about, and I think that's why we're here, and it's why we wrote this resource. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what anti-Semitism is. I'm going to go through it very, very quickly. If you want the nuance and the detail, you can find it on anti-Semitism and Understanding Anti-Semitism and in all of the richness and complexity that the topic deserves. So I'll just start by saying this. So anti-Semitism is the form of oppression that targets Jews. The form of anti-Semitism that we are all familiar with originates in European Christianity in early Europe. It spread throughout Europe over centuries and was eventually exported to the rest of the world via colonialism. And along the way caused untold hardship, pain, suffering, and death for Europe's Jewish population, obviously ultimately resulting in the Nazi Holocaust. This history is painful, and what's so sad is that it has been so cynically manipulated and confused by political actors who want to use the collective trauma and fear that many Jews have in order to attack social movements that they just don't agree with. So now I'm going to do something that I'm going to start off by making a mistake, which is to ignore a piece of advice that Linda gave me yesterday, something that none of you should ever do, which is, Linda said, Leo, don't talk about capitalism on this panel. I'm going to talk about capitalism. This is, sorry, Linda.
Go ahead.
Here's what you have to understand. So, anti-Semitism operates by telling lies about Jews, by spreading myths and stereotypes about who Jews are. And it also works by blaming Jews for the problems of society. It says that when things go wrong, Jews are to blame. Well, if you live in a capitalist society, things are going to go wrong. It is essentially, it's basically built into capitalism that there are these cycles of boom and bust. Times are good, times are bad. And in the history of Europe, what you see is that when times are good, Jews often were allowed to achieve a level of relative stability and security, sometimes prosperity, and assimilation into the cultures and the communities that they lived in. But when times were bad, communities that had been steeped in lies, myths, and stereotypes about Jews often turned on the Jews around them, and this is, what has led to so much pain and suffering. So, why are we talking about this today? Why is this so critical at this moment? When you think about white nationalists in the White House, when you think about white nationalists marching through the streets of Charlottesville, there could be nothing more counterproductive, nothing more hurtful to Jews than to be intentionally confusing the issue and muddying the waters by spreading false or inflated charges of anti-Semitism. Here's why. Number one, when the right does this, it slowly erodes our ability to accurately assess threats. It takes away our ability to tell who is a friend and who is an enemy. When we're constantly lobbing these accusations left and right, it makes it so hard for folks to be able to distinguish from real allies or potential allies who may not always agree with us about every single thing that we believe, but who deeply care about Jews and who have so many interests that are aligned with ours. When we can't do this, we can't form the powerful coalitions, the powerful movements that we need to achieve real change. that is just one of the really pernicious effects of false charges of anti-Semitism. And what our research when we were writing this paper on anti-Semitism showed is that again and again and again, real anti-Semitism and false charges of anti-Semitism have undermined, derailed, and distracted movements for social justice throughout history. Just think about this. At a moment when, for the past couple of years, we've just watched so many corners of the Jewish institutional world smear Palestine solidarity activists, attack the movement for Black lives, spend so much effort and energy trying to pass illiberal, anti-American, anti-BDS laws. While they were doing these things, the political right elected an actual white supremacist to the White House. That's just how confused many of us have become about who is a real threat, who we actually have to fear, and who, in fact, our friends and allies really are. It doesn't have to be this way, folks. Think about an alternate universe in which, in fact, our community spent this past year mobilizing a mass movement of Jews working in solidarity with all of the other communities who are threatened by white nationalism and the agenda of the Trump administration. Think about what that could have looked like, the power that we would have in this moment, and the friends we would be surrounded by. It's easy for me to imagine this alternate universe because I'm lucky enough to work for JFridge, and for the last 3 decades, JFridge has been doing exactly that locally here in New York City. We build deep, trusting partnerships with other organizations on the ground in New York fighting for racial and economic justice. We have the kinds of trusting, real meaningful relationships and friendships, often that go back years, decades, so that when things are tough, when things are confusing, we don't publish attack op-eds, about when we disagree. We get on the phone and we say, hey, something happened. You did something that, hurt my feelings. Let's talk it out. Let's figure it out. These are the kinds of relationships that, when we think about the left and the Jewish left in particular, these are the kinds of relationships that we could be having. But the waters have become so muddy that it's hard for us to find our way, to navigate. So I want to hold out that vision and say that this is why it's so, so important that we develop the kind of clear-eyed understanding of anti-Semitism, that we up our game and sharpen our analysis so that we don't fall prey to false charges, so that we recognize real anti-Semitism when we see it, and we have the tools and analysis we need to defeat it.
Woo.
Lena Morales.
Hello. Okay. Thank you all for having me. Shout out NZNG crew. I know some of y'all here. So what I'm basically going to be talking about is why we need to expand our analysis to consider anti-Semitism as not specifically or exclusively targeting white Ashkenazi people. And it's interesting, when we think about anti-Semitism, it is something that's conspicuously free of affecting people who aren't white Ashkenazim, even in New York City, where there are large, vibrant communities of Mizrahi Jews and many Jews of color like me. And so why is there this idea out that being of color somehow overrides your Jewishness, so that Jewishness is invisible on people like me, that non-white European Jews are basically a curiosity or a marginal? At the same time this is happening, the right wing and even some liberals have been pushing this idea that Muslims, Arabs, and black and brown people and communities are especially anti-Semitic. So for example, the knockout game, the idea that these black teenagers are just randomly knocking out Orthodox Jews for the fun of it, became a big meme. The idea, even among liberals, that people of color aren't grateful enough to a very small minority of liberal Jews who fought for civil rights in the 1960s, the absolute refusal to see anything rational or relatable in the Palestinian fight against Zionism, or Arab resistance to American imperialism in that region at all. I'm coming from Chicago. In Chicago, that's the home base of Louis Farrakhan, the Nation of Islam. Louis Farrakhan, I think he's an anti-Semite. But materially, how has he put Jews in danger? Not really, because he only really affects the black community. But people in Chicago, white Jews, love to talk about him and love to paint him as the ultimate anti-Semite. Why is that? And so I want to bring us into analysis where we think about how anti-Semitism factors into the structure of oppression that we're trying to dismantle. And I feel like this conversation, yes, does take us back to Europe. In Europe, we had anti-Semitism that went through many phases and was founded on many bases. So it was religious, it was cultural, it was racial. A common theme that we see throughout this anti-Semitism is the charge that Jews are inherently Eastern, that they do not belong in Europe, they are not properly European. And the charges here include the idea that Jews are economic parasites, Jews are exclusivists, Jews corrupt European society. I mean, if you look through the wide sweep of European history, there was hardly a single development that some European didn't like that wasn't blamed on the Jews at some point or another, right? And it's interesting, like there's the classic idea that, Jews have been blamed for capitalism and communism by the same people, and this leads us to the idea that like anti-Semitism is inherently irrational. It's like this demon. That actually isn't true, because these same people thought that capitalism would be nice if it was only done by Gentiles, right? So I want to get us away from this, like the classic mistake of liberals where they try to short circuit logic and show that it's irrational, and to think beyond that and think about what this ideology of anti-Semitism is used for, right? So in the previous example, we see that anti-Semitism is an ideological tool. And what does it do? It basically mystifies the exploitation that's happening within Western society. And it sort of keeps Western society in a state of reactionary innocence, right? Where all sort of social changes are done by outsiders. And we still see that happening within the right today. There's lots of right-wingers who think that, like, for example, miscegenation, right, is basically a Jewish plot, not that white people just wanted to marry and fall in love with people of color. And also, it's to have a scapegoat. And of course, you don't even need Jews in the society to fulfill that function. Like recently, there was a fascist march in Poland where they talked about the end of Jewish power. This is in a country that has far less than the 1% Jewish population, right? This was also used to fight the socialist movement, right? Socialist movement wasn't seen as a justified reaction to capitalist exploitation. It was seen as a Jewish plot to decimate Western society, and it was very successful in fighting against the socialist movement on that basis. So to get us beyond the sort of simplistic identity politics where you say, well, as a Jew, blah, 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 and I say, well, as a Jew too, blah, 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 right? I want to get us to a point where we think about like the danger that we are living under in terms of philo-Semitism. And philo-Semitism is basically, we live in a power structure that loves Jews to the extent that they do what this power structure wants us to do, right? And this isn't new. Like there's a pattern of outsiders and marginalized groups being used by big colonial imperialist powers sent to the colonies to gain a limited degree of freedom and a better reputation on the backs of other people, right? A lot of people came to this stolen land for that purpose, right? Like, this isn't even new among Jews. Like, there are lots of Jews who came to this continent and found a limited degree of autonomy and some freedom and some self-respect. And, like, for example, there was a Jewish community in Suriname that was founded by slavers, right? And they were considered an accomplishment by Western society and even a possible solution to the Jewish problem, right? And this talk isn't properly about Zionism, but I have to bring it in. Like, Zionism, if you look at the Zionist movement, it breezily characterized itself in the early days as a colonialist movement. It's never existed without the patronage of an imperialist Western power. It's always strived to be an outpost of Europe within the Middle East. It has never seriously considered regional integration. It enacted cultural genocide against Jewish cultures that didn't fit its version of a reconstituted Western Jewishness. And part of the reason that anti-Semitism, which was at an all-time high during World War II, came down afterwards is because there was lots of propaganda by the new Israeli state that was drawing parallels between the settler colonial history of the United States and Israel, right? So there were lots of, like, parallel histories of heroics to bond the state of Israel to the United States. We see this in the fact that the Zionist movement didn't seriously consider immigration of non-European Jews until it realized the extent of the Holocaust. And we see this in the fact that there are so many elite Ashkenazi Jews in Israel who are sort of mourning the fact that the state that they founded, that they thought was going to be liberal and secular and white and Ashkenazi, isn't so anymore and will probably never be again. The aching contradiction that Israel kicked out three-quarter of a million Palestinians and then had basically a similar number of Arab or Arabized Jews come in, right? Which was not necessarily their dream. We see this in the fact that the Zionist movement considers Israel to be a villa in the jungle, right? Not just against Arabs and Muslims broadly, but also within the Jewish population, right? And so to be clear and to go against simplistic identity politics, Jews can be anti-Semitic. Like, that's clear, right? And Jews can be reacting to anti-Semitism in doing so. And all throughout the history of Zionism, we see the traces of internalized anti-Semitism, right? For Western Jews who tried to assimilate and failed, and the desire not merely to lead Jews to safety, but to revolutionize the Jewish people on the basis of an ethnic nationalism that was fundamentally Western, to be seen as Western, to not allow the majority of Israeli Jewish citizens who are not European Ashkenazis to gain any prominence. And we see this in the fact that, like, even within my pro-Palestinian movement, there's a lot of liberal, elite, secular Ashkenazim who sort of mourn the idea that, like, those other people, those Mizrahim, those racist Mizrahim, are the people who spoiled the Zionist dream, right? We were never like that. It was those people. And I want us to consider the fact that the Zionist deal with Western imperialism is really a fantastic deal for the West, right? It has resolved the centuries-long Jewish question. And what is that question? The question is what to do with these Jews, right? It has resolved this in a way that was really quite easy for the West, that gave the West, a partner in imperialism in the Middle East and guarantees the West, of all places, as the guarantor of Jewish existence. And I think this is what leads to the contradictions that a lot of us are dealing with and groaning under. Just to wrap it up, there was a quote recently from Karl Lagerfeld, who I'm not going to say is like some academic or intellectual, right? And he said, and I really want to quote this, "You cannot kill millions of Jews and then take in millions of their worst enemies afterwards, even if there are decades between the two." Isn't this an incredible quote? I mean, this really, this is it, B. This is all you need to hear, right? We killed millions of Jews. The West killed millions of Jews, but it's those people who are the worst enemy of the Jews, who have never done anything like this. I'm not even saying that there isn't anti-Semitism in Arab Muslim countries. There's a history of that. I'm not saying that, right? But it's amazing the way that this has allowed the West to sort of regain a sort of an innocence, right? And not to be targeted by Jews as the people who are responsible for our genocide, right? And this is kind of incredible, and this sort of occludes a lot of things to think about. Anti-Semitism, we consider, there's this idea that anti-Semitism after World War II, people just woke up and they said, oh man, this was horrible for the Jews, and then it just dropped like that, right? We need to think about this in more materialist ways and how exactly this happened, and especially we need to think about this because anti-Semitism, maybe it has been at a low point, but it can always come back, right? Do we want to join in with these people who are going to paint themselves, not just the right wing, the Western society power structure as a whole, as the guarantors of Jewish existence, the people we need to turn to, as the people, as the unshakable alliance between America and Israel? If we think about it in these ways, we can get beyond simplistic identity politics. We can actually see how these things are interrelated, and we can fight them better. Thanks.
Rebecca Wilcomerson.
Good evening, everybody. It's really such an honor to be on a panel with a group of such smart and committed and thoughtful people. And after all the hoopla surrounding this event, it's very exciting just to be having a serious conversation about a serious subject. And this is what we really need to be doing. So I'm happy that we're all here together, and thank you all for being a part of it. Amy began her introduction talking about Charlottesville, and I wanted to start there too, because I also remember waking up on August 12th and seeing that video with young men screaming blood and soil and being truly terrified. And I think throughout this year we've seen incidents of vandalism, we've seen bomb threats, we've seen assaults, threats of violence towards Jews and Jewish institutions, and they've really become a regular staple of the news. And in my lifetime, at least, people who express support or tolerate anti-Semitism have never been so visible in the United States. President Trump this weekend tweeted a link to a website which, among other things, has printed a flowchart to illustrate Jewish influence over banking. Also this weekend, you may have seen the New York Times ran a warm and fuzzy profile of an open admirer of Hitler, which is an indicator, I think, that white nationalism has become a legitimate part of the national political conversation. So anti-Semitism in the United States is frighteningly and ever more visibly real. And all of us who believe in justice need to address that reality. JVP's primary mission is to work for the full equality and justice and freedom of all people in Israel-Palestine. And JVP has also increasingly become a home, a political and a spiritual home, for so many, and especially those of us who treasure our Jewish identity, but don't think that that requires identifying with a state that is practicing apartheid. We've always understood that fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of bigotry is a crucial reflection of our core political values. That's why we name it explicitly as part of our mission, and why we've published 2 books on the topic. But the question remains, how can we authentically engage in conversations about the real and appalling threat of anti-Semitism that truly exists, alongside the ways that accusations of anti-Semitism are often used as a cudgel to suppress criticism of Israel? To be clear, criticism of the Israeli state that is based on its past and present actions is not anti-Semitic. Palestinians experience systematic dispossession and displacement at Israeli hands, but that reality is often obscured in the public conversation because it becomes a conversation about perceived anti-Semitism rather than rights. And it's not easy. I want to acknowledge that it's not easy to talk at the same time about anti-Semitism as it exists and the way that some people use anti-Semitism, both accusations of it and feelings of victimization from it, to protect and deflect criticism of Israel. It requires honesty and self-reflection to hold both of those truths. Any discussion of anti-Semitism, about racism, about Israel, is loaded with each of our particular histories and the emotions that they bring out in us. We cannot have an honest conversation about any of these topics without acknowledging that we're not talking just about facts, but also about feelings. And the truth is, I am angry. I'm angry at the profound hypocrisy of the institutional Jewish community. If the past year has taught us nothing else, it should have taught us that loving Israel does not mean that you love Jews. Mm-hmm. In fact,
Right, Rebecca.
I'd argue that what we are seeing is an especially virulent Trumpian form of Zionist anti-Semitism, when those who will defend Israel's policies, regardless of their devastating impacts on Palestinians, align themselves with those that espouse and advance anti-Semitism. So just days ago, I think we probably all know this in this room, the far-right Zionist Organization of America feted Sebastian Gorka and Steve Bannon, which is only the most recent and most egregious example of Jewish institutions embracing rabid anti-Semites solely because they are Zionists. It is rooted in the long-standing policies of, quote, pro-Israel organizations to align themselves with Christian Zionist organizations like Christians United for Israel, whose commitment to Israel is based on hastening an apocalyptic Christian version of Armageddon in which all Jews will be converted or die a torturous death. I think we can agree that that is a rather anti-Semitic vision. But as long as you're pro-Israel, apparently you get a free pass. And I want to say that this is not just a right-wing phenomena. The less extreme version is when Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the ADL, or Bret Stephens, in the pages of the New York Times, create litmus tests and make false equivalencies between organizations like JVP and the so-called alt-right. It's profoundly dangerous, unethical, and inaccurate to characterize people and groups like JVP that support the full civil and human rights of Palestinians as not only anti-Semitic, but equivalent to Nazis.
Outrageous.
It minimizes the true fight against anti-Semitism we all desperately need to be waging, and it is a blatant attempt to shut down a much-needed conversation about Israel and its treatment of Palestinians. It is further profoundly dangerous, unethical, and inaccurate, not to mention racist and Islamophobic, to unendingly attack a person like our sister Linda Sarsour, who has proven herself to be an unflagging spokesperson for the rights of all people. She speaks out consistently against anti-Semitism and for the rights, nothing more, nothing less, of Palestinians, among others, among many others. These critiques are rooted in an Islamophobic worldview. It assumes that Palestinians who dare speak out against their own oppression by the Israeli government must automatically be doing so from a position of hating Jews. And it also requires, and we see this all the time, that those same Palestinians, when they do speak out against anti-Semitism, are disqualified and dismissed. It needs to be said, being anti-Zionist or non-Zionist does not make you anti-Semitic. The assumption that it does ignores history, including a long Jewish history of opposition to Zionism, and ignores the reality of how Zionism is experienced by its victims. In no way does it negate the seriousness of anti-Semitism to equally seriously address the dispossession of Palestinians by Israel. So while giving varying degrees of support and succor to figures who are truly anti-Jewish, Jewish institutions and individuals right now are supporting and encouraging the demonization of peaceful forms of resistance to Israel's human rights abuses. The institutional Jewish community has thus abdicated their crucial responsibility to fight against actual anti-Semitism. They've traded it for support of Israel, which leaves it to us, to all of us, to build the real intersectional movements for justice needed at this time. Our discussion tonight was seen as so provocative precisely because we collectively represent a new vision for fighting anti-Semitism.
Right.
We are insisting on a vision of resisting anti-Semitism that roots itself inside the broad fight against racism and oppression. We know that rather than falling into isolationism, that we are strengthened by and welcome tying all liberation struggles together. That no one can have a monopoly on who gets to have these conversations, least of all those who seek to do so in order to allow Israel to have free rein to suppress Palestinian rights. We believe that safety for Jews is rooted in connection, in joint struggle, and in mutual solidarity. All of these struggles take all of us. I, as a Jew, feel a deep obligation to support the struggle of Palestinians for their rights, and it's moving and humbling and a sign of the world we need to build when our allies speak out for our safety as Jews.
That's right.
And what we're speaking about tonight has, of course, been merely exacerbated, not created in this last year. But this last year has created this moment, that has an intense urgency. Nothing is predetermined. We don't know what's going to happen. It's a moment that's asking all of us to step up, to be brave, and to be precise about our language, to build a world that understands that our safety is tied to one another and that we can bring it about through solidarity and action together. to understand that none of us are free until all of us are, and to work to make it so. Thanks.
Woo.
Linda Sarsour.
Good evening, everyone. So I am really deeply honored and humbled to be here on the stage with people who have been some of the staunchest allies of the communities that I come from, of Muslim communities, of Palestinian communities, of Arab American communities. We've spent a lot of time on the front lines together, protecting each other, but also protecting other marginalized communities, and I'm so grateful to be on the same stage with you again tonight. So, apparently, I'm the biggest problem for the Jewish community. I am like the existential threat, apparently. And it really is very I'm confused, literally, every day. And I'm confused by people who actually don't know who I am, have never sat on a table with me, and for sure have never been anywhere near a social justice movement in these United States of America. And if they ever have been in space with me, including recently at the Left Forum for anyone who is here, one of the things I focused on at the Left Forum is I said to folks in the room, progressive folks, all pretty much down, I said to them, oftentimes when we come into conversation together, we always look at the ills of the things or the exterior to our progressive movement. What we really need to be doing is looking at the ills within the movement that we are a part of, which is not exclusive to anti-Semitism or to Islamophobia or to homophobia or to transphobia. My role here tonight was I was coming to speak to a progressive audience as a progressive leader in the progressive movement to say that we cannot dismantle anti-black racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, every phobia and ism without also dismantling anti-Semitism. That intersectionality, as an intersectional movement organizer, and I've been doing intersectionality way before last year when everybody thought it was cool to talk about intersectionality. Thank you to Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw for giving us that term. Intersectionality is not about black people and white people organizing together or Jews and Muslims organizing together. That's not what intersectionality is. Intersectionality is all of us organizing at the intersections of oppression and seeing oppression connected. So anti-Semitism is one branch on a larger tree of racism. So you can't just address one branch. You got to address all the branches together so we can get to the root of the problem. Apparently, the critics say, well, why are you all having a conversation about anti-Semitism? You're not experts in anti-Semitism and in Jewish communities. Well, first of all these people up here are Jews, if you didn't know. And I'm the resident non-Jew on this panel. And what I think is so ludicrous about that, which has basically been the argument for pretty much the 199 plus op-eds that are out there, because apparently people in the opposition have more times to write op-eds about us than about the administration, but that's okay. Or healthcare or immigrant rights or let's pass the DREAM Act maybe, but anyway, I digress. Apparently, it just really, like, I'm just dumbfounded. It's kind of like saying we all got to be critical race theorists to say Black Lives Matter or to talk about combating anti-black racism, or saying you have to be a Muslim or an expert in Islam to want to combat Islamophobia. We would never say that about any other form of oppression. So why do we want to frame this conversation that only Jews or those who are experts in anti-Semitism can, in fact, want to combat anti-Semitism? That's like 99% of us are going to be like, guess we don't qualify, so we're not going to combat anti-Semitism. It's actually a disservice to Jews to try to frame this conversation in this way. Just in case it's not clear, I am unapologetically Palestinian American and will always be unapologetically Palestinian American. I'm also unapologetically Muslim American. And guess what? I'm also a very staunch supporter of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Now, you can tell me if I'm crazy. What other way am I supposed to be as a Palestinian American? What other positions do people expect me to have as a Palestinian American who's a daughter of immigrants who lived under military occupation and still has family in Palestine who live under military occupation? I should be expected to have the views that I hold. And the fact that people want to frame the way that I choose to show up in a movement, they are denying my existence and my right to be an unapologetic Palestinian American who is not only a critic of the state of Israel, but I'm sure damn well a critic of the United States of America, and I always have been, even under the Obama administration. Now, what I'm here to say is this. I have always been an ally to Jewish communities. And one of the things that I've learned as a Muslim who belongs to a group of 1.8 billion people, that we ain't actually all the same. And I'm pretty sure that's the same in the Jewish community. So the confusion is, and I hope we're clarifying it for you tonight, that the Jewish community is also not a monolith. Not every single Jewish person that I've met sees their liberation or their Jewishness connected to the state of Israel. So the framing of this idea that in the progressive movement, somehow this imposition that we have to have is that all Jews, Israel, is inaccurate. It's false. The other thing that I want to say too is that if you want me to listen to what you have to say, if you want the progressive movement to be open-minded and hear the different arguments about how Zionism isn't all the same and not all Zionists are the same, and there's a lot of that conversation happening, what if you just showed up to the movement? What if it was okay to show up to a social justice movement and say, you know what, this is not about me. Let me show up and work for Black lives or undocumented immigrants. Let me roll up my sleeves for folks who are being impacted right now in this moment in such vicious ways. And guess what happens after you show up without putting conditions on your allyship and solidarity? Guess what happens? Eventually someone turns to you and says, who are you? Where did you come from? What is your story? That is what happens to me in the social justice movements. I have never showed up at a table and people who work with me on criminal justice reform, immigrant rights, healthcare access, you name it. I have never showed up to a table and said, before I sit down, raise your hand if you believe in the liberation of the Palestinian people. Raise your hand if you believe in BDS. That never happens because that's not how the movement works. The movement is a place to build transformative relationships. It's an opportunity for you to show up, give your all to another marginalized community, and by nature, people reciprocate that solidarity, people humanize you, and people ask you, what can I do for you? What are you being impacted by? Because I want to show up for you. So what I hope that you get from this conversation is this. I don't care who you are, Jewish or not Jewish, we all must commit to dismantling anti-Semitism. And that the existential threat resides in the White House, in the highest offices of these lands. And if what you're reading all day long, morning and night in the Jewish media is that Linda Sarsour and Minister Farrakhan are the existential threat to the Jewish community, something really bad's going to happen and we're going to miss the mark on it. So what I say to all of you here is that I am not looking for any approval from Zionists, right-wing Zionists, from Jewish Americans, from not Jewish Americans. I don't need anybody to invite me to the movement to dismantle anti-Semitism. I come here because I believe in it and it's the right thing to do for all of us. And guess what else is going to happen? By default, even our opposition is going to benefit from the solidarity and the work that we do here. What they don't know is eventually they will be protected based on the work that we will do to risk our lives to protect the most marginalized people in this country, including our Jewish sisters and brothers. Thank you.
Woo! Woo!
So right now, people are collecting cards, and we're going to take those cards and put them to the panelists. But I wanted to start by asking Leo Ferguson, if you can talk about these anti-oppression trainings you've been doing, how you unite the various, how you unite the various approaches to the different hates that affect everyone's communities. And why you feel you need to engage in these sessions.
That's a great question, thanks. Oh, that's a hard act to follow. I will do my best. So, you know, long before the election, J-Fridge was already thinking about these questions, was already thinking about anti-Semitism and recognizing that there was a real lack of analysis. And so this project, you know, the project that we began that includes trainings, the resource that we just put out, Understanding Anti-Semitism, and all sorts of, you know, deep thinking and deep wrestling began a ways before the election. And we, you know, really our focus was, you know, a lot of what Linda was just talking about was really thinking about talking to our partners throughout the movement left, as well as to our own community, and engaging around, you know, a piece of, you know, a place where there really was not enough shared analysis and not enough real clarity about this issue. And, you know, so we have done trainings, we have worked very, very hard to develop a intersectional left analysis of anti-Semitism that is actually useful to folks who are out there engaging on the front lines of the battle against white supremacy and white nationalism across this country. But, you know, it takes more than trainings. And so at J-Fridge, you know, one of the things that we have really been doing is trying to figure out how to have these interventions, you know, in our work, in the context of campaigns for social justice. So for example, you know, I think a couple of years ago now at this point, or a year and a half ago at least, J-Fridge started working with a group called the Laundry Worker Center here in New York City. That's been, this is a really, really wonderful organization that organizes retail workers and low-wage workers around their rights in the workplace. And they had started a campaign working with warehouse workers at B&H Photo. So I don't know if you guys know B&H Photo. Folks know it? Yeah. So this is a, you know, sort of a New York icon. It's this big superstore, and it's, you know, very visibly run by Orthodox Jews. What a lot of people don't know is that the warehouses in the back rooms, it's mostly low-income folks of color, mostly Latinx folks, immigrants, and they were being really poorly treated, exploited, and they wanted to form a union. And so Laundry Worker Center had started organizing with them, and J-Fridge was really eager to work on this campaign because we recognize that when non-Jews are organizing in the context of criticizing a Jewish employer who's doing really, really bad stuff, that there is the potential for both false charges of anti-Semitism to be leveled against them, and also, you know, potentially for actual anti-Semitism to crop up in a contentious and complicated, you know, fight for justice. And so, you know, we were able to both play a really, you know, a wonderful role in this really powerful campaign, and also do the kind of, you know, real relationship building between our members and our staff and the folks from B&H and the folks from the Laundry Worker Center to build the kinds of real relationship and trust and understanding that allows for a successful campaign like that one, that shows that you can take on Jews who are committing bad acts, who are committing immoral acts, without becoming confused about why. That we criticize people for what they do and not who they are. And that we can, you know, be critics of capitalism and for people, bad actors in capitalism, without getting confused about anti-Semitism. So it's this kind of on-the-ground work and the kind of relationship building, you know, that is so key. And so that's, you know, that's why we wrote this resource. It's why we have done the trainings that we've done, and it's really what, you know, drives all of our thinking.
Lena Morales, you were the education. Woo! You were the education director of JVP, of Jewish Voice for Peace. What do you think is the greatest misconception about JVP?
Wow, that's a big one. I mean, one thing, there is a conception about JVP that I'm not going to say is 100% inaccurate. And here, just let me describe what I'm talking about before everyone gets up. So I am a very passionate anti-Zionist, right? And I have been since I took my birthright trip in 1998, right? And I mean, this shouldn't be news. This is a very common trajectory, like super common, right? And I even went during like a really liberal time in Israel's history. 98 was when people were wearing Shalom Achshav t-shirts. Like, it was very different from how it is now. And so it was a little bit interesting for me to go to this state and realize the parallels between my life in Southside Chicago and how Palestinians are treated in Israel. It was an interesting thing. And you know, since I was alienated from my Jewishness because I'm not white and because I'm a woman and because I'm queer and other reasons, for a while I was sort of a typical person who sort of like, I was like, as a Jew, I'm against the state of Israel. Hurrah! Right? And it took me a while and a specific context to not use that so simplistically and to come to a place where I could really understand these issues in context, to understand how all of this is wrapped up within the broad sweep of Jewish history, in the Jewish experience in the West, to come to a place where, like, I have a lot more access to Jewish community. Some of that is through JVP and lefty Jewish spaces, and some of that's through other places, specifically, actually, Yiddish circles, right? But I do not, for me, being anti-Zionist is not me saying, like, I am an enlightened Jew, and I just, I am not tribal, or I am not parochial, and I do not only care about Jews, right? And this is the basis of my anti-Zionism, because I'm above, this is, and I hate to say this, but there are, and this is no shade to JVP, I do stuff with them, but there are Jews in JVP who sort of have this attitude, right? This is a problem. Right? I do this work because I am a Jew and I care about the fate of the Jewish people. I just want to put that out there. I don't feel like this is said enough. Like, I honestly consider Zionism to be like the man in the high castle, like, dystopia of Jewish history. Like, it's just so bad. It was a mistake. It has led us down a dangerous and horrible road. And it's difficult to sort of look at your own people and see a lot of them supporting something that I think is very oppressive and very wrong. But I do this because I am a Jew. I don't do this because I'm above Jewishness. I feel like there's a lot of people who think that. This is a problem within the anti-Zionist left in here and in Israel. There are lots of anti-Zionists in Israel who are, this sort of elite person, white, secular, Ashkenazi, right? Someone with economic privilege, that will sort of be like, well, like, I wouldn't be so parochial as to care about Jews. No, because I care about Jews, I am anti-Zionist, right? So, I mean, that is something that I hear a lot, like, oh, like, you couldn't possibly be a passionate and committed Jew who cares about the religion, who cares about the culture, who cares about Jewish diversity and Jewish strength and Jewish community, and have these positions, right? That's something I hear as a charge against JVP a lot. And, like, that's a problem.
I'm going to go right into these questions. Is there a space for people who want to be in the movement for justice in Palestine who do not support BDS? And this is a follow-up for Linda Sarsour. Social Democrats USA recently passed a resolution supporting the BDS movement. It did so as Democratic Zionists supporting full BDS. Can you work together with such Zionists? Can they be legitimate feminists?
Lord have mercy. All right. This is where I get in trouble and I get into all the headlines tomorrow. They start at 6 a.m., so wake up early. I'll start with the first one. Boycott, divestment, sanctions is actually a tactic. People have basically labeled it as one organization or like an institution that's after the State of Israel, although BDS has been used throughout history, including against South African apartheid. So let's get the facts straight there. BDS was called by Palestinian civil society, the Palestinian people asking for the international world to join them in calling for BDS to end the human rights violations that the Israeli state continues to commit against the Palestinian people. So I'm a supporter of BDS. Not everybody's a supporter of BDS, right? My main point here, and other Palestinians may disagree with me, just don't work against my right to engage in BDS, right? I am part of the BDS movement. There are many student groups that are part of the BDS movement. There are people who support the BDS movement, but in no way, shape, or form, as someone who may not be in support of BDS, should you be supporting the criminalization of those of us who do support BDS as a tactic of free speech. So the question has a simple answer. You're allowed to be whoever you want and support whatever you want. Just don't stop my right to support what I want and the movements that I want to be a part of. That's the first answer to the first question. That was more simpler than the second part. So here's where this question about Zionism for me gets a little confusing. So I'm going to put this forth. My understanding of Zionism is this idea that post the Holocaust, there was this movement to create a safe home for the Jewish people and to declare the right to self-determination for the Jewish people. That's what my understanding is. Now, hold that for a second. I'm going to put that right here. And then I'm going to go over here. So why can't there be another truth about what Zionism is? That Zionism, as a Palestinian American who is the daughter of a Palestinian grandmother who was born in 1927 and is still alive today, was 21 years old when the State of Israel was created. How come my grandmother can't say that Zionism displaced her family, killed Palestinians, made Palestinians refugee, and stole the homeland and the actual land and olive trees and actual infrastructure of the Palestinian people? So there's this idea that there's only one truth and that we're not allowed to have two truths. I think that I have the right to talk about how Zionism has impacted Palestinians as a Palestinian American and a daughter of Palestinian immigrants who were born and raised in Palestine and come from generations and generations of lineage of people who lived way before there was ever a state of Israel. So that's the first thing. That's where we drift away on this question. So I don't know what people want me to think about Zionism as someone who's Palestinian. It just really boggles my mind what my position is supposed to be. Now, on the second question, there's been this question about Zionism and feminism and whether you can be a Zionist and a feminist. This is what I say about that just in general, not even specifically looking at that particular equation. People want to talk about the social justice movement as if I have the key to the movement, as if I'm the one that stands on the door and gets to give you a litmus test before you get there and say, if you're a Zionist, you can't be a feminist, or if you're this, you can't be here. There's a table. Tables all over the city, all over the country, where people are on the front lines to protect health care, to protect people with disabilities, to stand for dreamers, to stand with black people in the sanctity of black life. If you are going to come to the movement with a condition, with the imposition that people need to know that you are a Zionist and a feminist, and only under this idea that we have to accept you as a Zionist and a feminist because you want to impose that on everybody else in the movement, I'm just letting you know that's just not how it works in the movement. No one else does that. Just so you know, maybe because you haven't been there, you don't know. But no one actually walks into the movement and says, here are the 6 things that I am. That's not how this works. People come to social justice with the commitment to be part of an intersectional movement that stands up for the rights of all people. Now, if you are the type of Zionist who doesn't believe that there are even a such thing as Palestinians or that Palestine even exists, how could you be in a movement denying someone's existence? So there's a spectrum of people who are Zionists. Every single day, a new person tries to explain to me what kind of Zionist they are. I didn't know that there was a spectrum, that you could be a soft Zionist and a Zionist that believes in 2 states, and there are other Zionists all the way to the right that align with white supremacists. I get confused. Let me tell you something that is really important. I say this to my Jewish sisters and brothers. When I did speak at the CUNY Graduate Center graduation back in June, something really disturbing happened. I have no problem with people protesting, free speech. You protest me, it's cool. I'm fine with it. I support you. But what was really confusing to me at that moment was how is it that people who were Jewish, some of whom were actually visibly Jewish, were standing in a rally against me with Milo Yiannopoulos, with Richard Spencer, with Gavin McGinnis. Like, how, it didn't make sense. And I even had young people in the progressive movement who are not Jewish being like, how does this make sense? They're like, didn't you say they were anti-Semites and they don't like Jews? But why are they in there with them? I don't have an answer. I didn't have a good answer. I was like, I hope the Jewish community stands up and says, that's wrong. That under no circumstances should Jewish people align with people like Milo or Pamela Geller or Richard Spencer or whatever, or Gavin McGinnis. Like, come on now. So, all I'm saying is this. I am not as important as I'm made out to be. And I'm not the one that actually gets to say who gets to be in the movement and who doesn't get to be in the movement. What I do recommend as a suggestion, just to give you some advice, is we are in a very important moment, in a critical moment. So let's stop talking about the civil rights movement that was 50 years ago. There is a civil rights movement happening right now. We are now living under fascism. That's what I believe. And we need all hands on deck. When I go home, I don't agree with half the people in my family. But guess what? I love them anyway. So if you believe that you have to be part of a movement where you show up and agree with everybody, then this definitely ain't the movement for you. Because I don't agree with half the people in the movement either. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm a criminal justice reform activist, and I organize with people that I love dearly who are prison abolitionists. I'm not going to lie to you, I ain't there yet. I'm almost there, but I'm not there yet. I still believe certain people, child rapists, certain kinds of people, still need to be away from society, right? I'm not there. I'm not a prison abolitionist yet. But I still organize with them. I still love them. I still go to their birthday parties. I still stand on the front lines of the movement. I get arrested and put in jail cells with them as prison abolitionists, which is really interesting when that happens. But my point is, this movement, there has to be priorities. And the priorities is to protect the most marginalized people, is to protect our health care, is to protect the open internet, is to protect our democracy and the opportunities for us to disagree respectfully in this country. I have no problem with anybody telling me, Linda, I do not agree with you. Linda, I do not agree with you on this issue. That's cool. But don't threaten my family. Don't threaten my children, don't slander and defame me, and don't engage in Islamophobic innuendos and try to connect stories together that don't actually connect. Let's talk about the track record. When the Gaza war happened in 2014, I'm going to end with these two last quick things. When the Gaza war happened in 2014, where over 2,000 people were killed, there were people in my own community, some of whom were engaging in anti-Semitism. I stood boldly and said that we do not need to poison a pure movement for the liberation of the Palestinian people and ending the siege on Gaza with anti-Semitism, and I will not stand for it. And I said that to my own people. And I'm asking you to say that to people in your community, that you will not stand for people in your community engaging in Islamophobia and anti-Arab and anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian rhetoric. Now, the last example that I'll give. When a Jewish cemetery was vandalized in St. Louis, I was moved by that as an American Muslim who understands and has experienced vandalism of the institutions that I love. So we went up, me and my friend Tariq, we started a fundraiser. And we said, as a very small gesture of solidarity to the Jewish community, we were going to raise a very simple $20,000. And we knew that our Jewish sisters and brothers deserved more than that, but we said, we don't know, we're just going to let's do 20,000 and see where this goes. Within one day, we raised $162,000. Now wait, I'm not saying that to say, because we've raised money for black churches. Like, it's not about the raising of the money. That's actually the easiest thing that I know how to do. This is the point. The point is, I didn't know what kind of Jews were in that cemetery. I didn't know what the politics was. I didn't know the history of the cemetery. They could have been Zionists, anti-Zionists. They could have been, I don't know what. It didn't matter to me at that moment. All I know is that a religious institution was vandalized, and we would set out to show a gesture of solidarity to the Jewish community. Then we raised $162,000. We weren't prepared to spend $160,000. That was more work for us to do. So instead of members of the Jewish community saying, and many of them were very gracious and grateful, and I love them very much, but some engaged in this tactic against us to push other people away who may never want to show solidarity based on the experiences that we got, saying, what happened to all the money? If you were going to give $20,000 to the St. Louis Cemetery, what happened to the other $140,000? What they didn't know is that we had people researching online, trying to find other institutions that could benefit from the money that we raised. So we had to do extra manpower and work extra hours to go and distribute money to Jewish organizations around the country, which we did, including, I hope, what you will be very proud to know is that we took over a cemetery in Colorado that has literally been in shambles for the past 30 years under the watch of a blind old Jewish man who has loved it, but has not found the resources to fix it up, and that there will be an official ceremony by the state of Colorado in the reopening of a refurbished and beautiful Jewish cemetery in Colorado 35 years later. And that was because of the contributions of American Muslims and Palestinian Americans who were showing their Jewish sisters and brothers that we got you, we got your back, that we are in this together, and we will do that 100 times again, no matter what the opposition says, because we will not be divided by them. Because their efforts to divide us are a disservice to Jewish communities. Their conflation of the critique of the state of Israel and true anti-Semitism is a disservice to the Jewish community, and I hope that you reflect today and see the sincerity of the people that are on the stage that are willing to do whatever it takes. We've all been arrested. We've all been in situations that have proven over and over again that we are willing to die for the things that we believe in to protect all marginalized people in this country, including our Jewish family.
There are some questions that I'm just not going to put to the panel or allow them to answer, like this one. How is it that all of you are so smart, beautiful, and brilliant leaders? But here is one that I'd like to put to the panelists. In a JVP video, Linda said anti-Semitism was not structural like anti-black racism. You got a lot of criticism. Could you further explain what you mean?
So,
Let me just start because I said it.
okay.
So,
Go for it.
and then I'm gonna let my Jewish sister reinforce. So, can we just have an open, honest conversation? That's why we're all here. Of course, anti-Semitism was institutionalized in places like Europe, which is why we ended up having the Holocaust. No one's going to deny that anti-Semitism historically has been institutionalized. This is the point that I was making. There are two people on the stage who are Jews of color, right? What I was saying, that today in 2017, while we have prevalent anti-Semitism, pervasive, like literally in-your-face anti-Semitism, what I was saying was it's not written into the law, into the criminal justice system, right? It's not written in the same way that anti-black racism is, or xenophobia is written, or Islamophobia. So what I was saying is that as a white Jew or as a white male Jew, for example, you may not get beat up by a police officer in the same way that a black Jew would or a person of color would, that you will not experience the criminal justice system in the same way that a black person will, or a Muslim will, or a Latinx person will. So what I was saying is it's not that we're denying that anti-Semitism is real and it is pervasive around us and we hear it and it's in the White House. I was saying that it wasn't institutionalized and written into the law right now in 2017. That's all I was saying. So I hope that you agree that if you are a white woman who considers herself to be Jew, that you don't have the same experience as a black woman in America. That's not something that I should have to apologize for. Actually, people need to apologize for me if you're trying to make that argument. So I was really taken aback by the criticism that I received. And I looked over at people of color who are Jews, and I was like, am I crazy? They were like, no, you're not crazy. You're absolutely right. So that's what I was saying, and I wanted to clarify that, and I'll give it to Rebecca.
Well, I can be brief now because basically I agree. But I did ask Amy to choose this question because it was something that I didn't get to say in my opening remarks that I really wanted to make sure that we got to. And I think it's because it can be hard to talk about because the conversation so often gets twisted, right? So when we want to be able to have nuanced conversations and do that thing that Linda was talking about earlier of like holding two truths at once. So it can be true that anti-Semitism is a real issue, and I think we've covered that pretty exhaustively tonight. And I began my talk talking about it. And it can be also true that for those of us who are white Jews, we're not experiencing structural anti-Semitism in the way that black people in this country, indigenous people in this country, Latinx people in this country are experiencing racism. And so it's hard to have that conversation. I can almost guarantee that someone's gonna, again, take that quote out of context and say, well, Rebecca Wilcomerson says anti-Semitism is less important than all these other forms of racism. It's not that, but we need to look at the reality of what's happening in this country and what people are facing, and that we as white Jews in particular, speaking specifically about white Jews right now, what we're facing is some very, very, very scary incidents that are happening personally, but we are not seeing that right now. We are not seeing that the power structures of this country are putting us in jail as Jews. They're not gentrifying us as Jews. They are not all the different things that we see as part of racism. So that's one piece I wanted to put out. The other piece I wanted to put out, because this is a book talk, and I do want to encourage folks to read the book. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a tiny excerpt from a chapter that Tali Ben Daniel, who's on the JVP staff and is a member of the Jews of Color, Mizrahi and Sephardi Caucus, that she wrote in the book, and I encourage you all to read the essay because it's very thorough. And she talks about the ways that the histories of Mizrahi Jews have been impacted by Zionism and the state of Israel, and the way they've contributed to and sometimes have been the source of Mizrahi oppression, and how in the U.S. that the cultural articulation that equates Jewishness with whiteness doesn't account for the impact of Zionism on Jewish racial identity.
Can you just explain one thing for people who aren't in the know? What is a Mizrahi Jew?
Sorry, Mizrahi Jews are Jews that come from Arab countries, and Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews, the Sephardi Jews those come originally from Spanish-speaking countries, as opposed to Ashkenazi Jews that come from Europe. So the cultural articulation that equates Jewishness with whiteness without accounting for the impact of Zionism on Jewish racial identity, I'm quoting now, furthers and perpetuates white Ashkenazi dominance in Jewish spaces. And then she says, the collective impact of this is to allow progressive white Jewish communities in the U.S. to avoid confronting racial oppression within the Jewish community, with the U.S. more broadly, and within Israel-Palestine. And I think that's a really crucial point. We need to be able to acknowledge that sometimes anti-Semitism is used as an excuse for those of us who are white in the Jewish community not to grapple with the racism that also exists in the Jewish community. And that's one of the conversations we need to have if we are going to be good allies and good accomplices to other communities.
This person asked, my 88-year-old bubby insists the white nationalists and Nazis that marched in Charlottesville were a bunch of wahoos, and I'm wasting my time paying attention to it, that she lived through the real thing, that this is media hype. How do I convince her otherwise?
I mean, this is just like, I just want to be real that there were so many people in Europe who thought the same thing about the Nazis, right? There were so many people who thought, oh, Germans are like the... What? I'm speaking right now, so could I just finish my sentence? Is that cool? Are we good here? What up? Yeah.
Thank you. Woo! Thank you. Woo!
Yeah. I think the danger that we're seeing here, yes, I mean, not only were there so many people in Europe who thought, I mean, there were Jewish communities in Europe who thought, oh, this is just another pogrom, this is another bad government, this will be over. I mean, do you know how many German Jews really thought that, like, there were so many deeply acculturated German Jews who thought it was impossible that Germany, this, model of civilization, could ever turn on them in the horrible, brutal way that it totally did. So that's just one thing. But also, like, what I want to sort of bring to the table when we talk about this is that, like, a good way to think about the way that racial politics have developed in this country is that there was sort of a break after World War II, right? And why was that? And that was because that the United States was fighting against a white supremacist power, Nazi Germany. They were also fighting against Imperial Japan that was making a challenge to white supremacy. I mean, they did this actually very explicitly, right? And so it's after World War II that we see things like Judeo-Christian values. That term existed before World War II, but it got popularized afterwards, right? And we've had this sort of like white supremacy, which was explicit in American society very openly, very boldly, right? People would just straight up say, white people are superior, black people don't know how to think, et cetera, has sort of gone underground. We've sort of had this sort of like color blindness, these like sort of racial liberalism is I guess what I would call it, right? And that's existed for about like a half a century, and this is the context in which many of us have been raised up, right? We're in different times because very soon America is no longer going to be a majority white, no longer going to be a majority white country, right? For the second time in its history, right? And I feel like, a lot of us who maybe grew up in sort of more liberal spaces or multicultural spaces or sort of believe these sort of like convenient liberal myths that paper over what is really brutal white supremacy when you actually look at the material effects of what happens, right? We're in a new time because there are lots of people seeing that, this is coming. And does this actually mean the end of white dominance in the United States? And it's these contradictions with the contradictions of capitalism that have led to like a really resurgent fascist and white supremacist movement, right? Like, I'm not saying like every group of Nazis, while they're horrible and should be met with fierce resistance and Antifa and beatdowns, I'm totally down with that, right? Not every Nazi group that has ever existed has like, some of them were real flashes in the pan. I think if you look at the historical context that we're living in and like why, I don't think America is going to transition from a majority white country to a minority white country without a severe backlash, without severe like backlash from white people and white supremacists. Like that's just the reality as I see it happening, right? And I think that is why white supremacy on the rise. And there's like, this sort of racial liberalism, which didn't really serve people of color either, right? But is now sort of under attack from both sides, from like people of color who actually want liberation, and from white people, white supremacists who want to assert that this country is theirs and assert some sort of fake reactionary nostalgia for something that never was, right? So that's the context in which we're living. And like, I mean, you could say, oh, they're yahoos, they're losers, I don't care. But what happens if they're not? What happens if they gain power? Do you really want to like, do you want to gamble on that? Do you want to be like, whatever, I'll just let some Nazis do whatever. It's not a big deal. What's the worst that could happen? Like, come on. Wake up, B.
Can I say one thing about that?
Yes, and with Leo's comment, we're going to end.
Okay, I'll keep it brief. I just want to, sort of complicate that a little bit and just say that one of the things that's so, this has been brought up earlier, one of the things that's so dangerous about the false charges of anti-Semitism, the inflated charges of anti-Semitism, is that it tweaks our historical trauma. It tweaks the very real fears that lots and lots of Jews have. And there's a kind of hypervigilance and a real confusion about, where threats lie, right? And so, I think one of the things that's so scary is that, we have these moments like the moment that we're in right now where we have very visible anti-Semitism, showing up all across America. And it's very hard to know what historical moment we're in, whether or not this is a flash in the pan or whether this portends something, you know, a lot more deadly and dangerous. And when we're already when we're already hypervigilant and sort of ungrounded, we can't make the kinds of real distinctions between threats and a few yahoos, right? And so, you know, I just want to hold out that there are reasons to be genuinely vigilant, and also it is possible to reach a grounded conclusion that there is no existential threat to Jews in the United States right now. One could appear in the future, or it could not. Having real clarity about anti-Semitism allows us to actually exhale and make real, considered, calm judgments about the landscape that we actually find ourselves in. When there are real threats, we get to meet them with vigor and force, and if there's genuine danger, we get to fight back. And when there isn't, we get to say, those are some yahoos, I think I'll change the channel. Or I will, set my level of fear and my level of vigilance appropriately. And I think, you know, one of the things that we see is that, you know, number one, just to say that, like, you know, for folks who, you know, that one of the things that I think I've seen a number of times, certainly this year, and you know, with Charlottesville, with the March for Racial Justice, and a number of things, that you have, I think, white Jews who really want to engage, but are carrying around some of these fears and some of this vigilance and a real sense of, I don't know what I'm getting myself into, I don't know who my friends are. And what that can look like is that when there are moments when, you know, we're trying to have real solidarity and show that white supremacy and white nationalism impacts all of us. You know, you look at Charlottesville and you see the way that so many communities are being targeted and are being swept up in this. Sometimes you'll also see folks kind of, see white Jews, you know, it comes up with the litmus test, it comes up with the sort of push-pull of white Jewish engagement with movements for social justice. And you know, it's like, for Jews to be able to show up and say, my voice is central in this movement. Like, I am being targeted by white supremacy and white nationalism, and it is vital that I be here and I be in this conversation. And also, that maybe I don't need to be centered in this conversation all the time, that there are folks who are more directly impacted, who are facing what Linda brought up, who are facing state violence, mass incarceration, deportation, and being able to make those kinds of rational, grounded assessments allows us to both foreground our oppression, but do it in the context of the broader movement that we all are engaged in.
Well, clearly the conversation continues, and you can actually continue that conversation individually, as folks here are going to be signing books. And thank you very much for coming out for a very interesting evening.
Got its over, but it was fabulous.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's really over. We'll see. Thank you. That was great. Yeah. You're all flowers. Impressive. Oh, yeah. If anyone wants to buy a book, come on over.